The Eureka Rebellion in 1854 was a rebellion of gold miners of Ballarat, Victoria, Australia, who revolted against the colonial authority of the United Kingdom. The Battle of the Eureka Stockade, by which the rebellion is popularly known, was fought between miners and the colonial forces of Australia on 3 December 1854 at Eureka Rebellion, named for the stockade structure erected by miners during the conflict. The rebellion lasted for less than half an hour and resulted in the deaths of at least 27 people, the majority of whom were rebels. The event was the culmination of a period of civil disobedience in the Ballarat region during the Victorian gold rush, with miners objecting to the expense of a miner's licence, taxation via the licence without representation, and the actions of the government, the police and military. The local rebellion grew from a Ballarat Reform League movement and culminated in the erection by the rebels of a crude battlement and a swift and deadly siege by colonial forces. Mass public support for the captured rebels in the colony's capital of Melbourne when they were placed on trial resulted in the introduction of the Electoral Act 1856, which mandated full white male suffrage for elections for the lower house in the Victorian Parliament. The second instituted political democracy in Australia. As such, the Eureka Rebellion is controversially identified with the birth of democracy in Australia and interpreted by some as a political revolt. Background: protests on the goldfields. 1851 to 1854. Hiscock's gold rush began on 12 August 1851 following the publication in the Geelong Advertiser of Thomas Hiscock's gold findings at Hiscock's, 3 kilometres west of Buninyong. Just days later, on 16 August 1851, Lieutenant Governor Latrobe proclaimed in the Government Gazette Crown rights for all mining proceeds and a licence fee of 30 shillings per month, effective from 1 September 1851. On 26 August, a rally of 40 to 50 miners opposing the fee was held at Hiscock's Gully, the first of many such protests in the colony. The miners opposed government policies of oppression, including the licence fee, and demanded rights to vote and to buy land. This first meeting was followed by dissent across the colony's mining settlements. In December, the government announced that it intended to triple the licence fee from £1 to £3 a month, from 1 January 1852. This move incited protests around the colony, including the Forest Creek Monster Meeting of December 1851. In Ballarat, historian Weston Bate noted that diggers became so agitated that they began to gather arms. The government hastily repealed its plans due to the reaction. Nevertheless, the oppressive licence hunts continued and increased in frequency, causing general dissent among the diggers. In addition, Weston Bate noted that the Ballarat diggings were in strong opposition to the strict liquor licensing laws imposed by the government. Changes to the Goldfields Act in 1853 allowed licence searches to occur at any time, which further incensed the diggers. In Bendigo in 1853, an anti-gold licence association was formed and the miners were apparently on the brink of an armed clash with authorities. Again in 1854, Bendigo miners responded to an increase in the frequency of twice-weekly licence hunts with threats of armed rebellion. Murder of James Scobie and the burning of Bentley's Hotel on 6 October 1854. Scottish miner James Scobie was murdered at the Eureka Hotel. 10 days later, on 17 October 1854, between 1,000 and 10,000 miners gathered at the hotel to protest the acquittal of James Bentley, the hotel proprietor and prime suspect in Scobie's murder, by a corrupt magistrate. The miners rioted and Bentley and his wife Catherine fled for their lives as the hotel was burnt down by the angry mob. A small group of soldiers were unable to suppress the riot. Further unrest on the 22nd of October 1854, Ballarat Catholics met to protest the treatment of Father Smith. The next day, the arrests of miners McIntyre and Fletcher for the Eureka Hotel fire provoked a mass meeting which attracted 4,000 miners. The meeting resolved to establish a Diggers' Rights Society to protect their rights. On the 1st of November 1854, 3,000 miners met once again at Bakery Hill. They were addressed by Thomas Kennedy, Henry Holyoake, George Black and Henry Ross. The diggers were further angered by the arrest of another 7 of their number for the Eureka Hotel fire. Ballarat Reform League. On Saturday the 11th of November 1854, a crowd estimated at more than 10,000 miners gathered at Bakery Hill, directly opposite the government encampment. At this meeting, the Ballarat Reform League was created, under the chairmanship of Chartist John Basson Humphrey. Several other Reform League leaders, including Kennedy and Holyoake, had been involved with the Chartist movement in England. Many of the miners had past involvement in the Chartist movement and the social upheavals in Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe during the 1840s. In setting its goals, the Ballarat Reform League used the British Chartist movement's principles. The meeting passed a resolution that it is the inalienable right of every citizen to have a voice in making the laws he is called on to obey, that taxation without representation is tyranny. The meeting also resolved to secede from the United Kingdom if the situation did not improve. Throughout the following weeks, the League sought to negotiate with Commissioner Robert Reid and the Governor of Victoria, Sir Charles Hutham, both on the specific matters relating to Bentley and the Scobies' death, and the men being tried for the burning of the Eureka Hotel, and on the broader issues of abolition of the licence, suffrage and democratic representation of the goldfields, and disbanding of the Gold Commission. Governor Hutham, on 16 November 1854, appointed a Royal Commission on Goldfields Problems and Grievances. However, Commissioner Reid, rather than hear miners' grievances, increased the police presence in the goldfields and summoned reinforcements from Melbourne. Many historians attribute this to his belief in his right to exert authority over the rabble. On 28 November 1854, the reinforcements marching from Melbourne were attacked by a crowd of miners. A number were injured and a drummer boy was allegedly killed. The rumor of the drummer boy's death was perpetuated, even with a memorial erected to him in Ballarat Cemetery for many years. Although historical research has shown that the boy, John Egan, continued military service until dying in 1860. At a meeting of about 12,000 diggers on the following day, the Reform League delegation relayed its failure to achieve any success in negotiations with the authorities. The miners resolved on open resistance to the authorities and to burn the hated licenses. Reid responded by ordering police to conduct a license search on 30 November. 8 defaulters were arrested, and most of the military resources available had to be summoned to extricate the arresting officers from the angry mob that had assembled. This raid prompted a change in the leadership of the Reform League, to people who argued in favor of physical force, rather than the moral force championed by Humphrey and the old leadership. Battle of the Eureka Stockade, paramilitary mobilization and swearing allegiance to the Southern Cross in the rising tide of anger and resentment amongst the miners. A more militant leader, Peter Laylaw, was elected. In swift fashion, a military structure was assembled. Brigades were formed, and captains were appointed. Licenses were burned, and on 1 December at Bakery Hill, the disaffected miners held a meeting where the Australian flag of independence was solemnly consecrated and vows proffered for its defence, with the Eureka oath being sworn by Peter Laylaw to the affirmation of his fellow demonstrators, who encamped themselves around the flag to resist further license hunts and harassment by the authorities. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. The white and blue Eureka flag, said to be designed by a Canadian miner, Captain Henry Ross, and bearing nothing but the Southern Cross, was then flown for the first occasion, according to the Ballarat Times, which first mentioned the flag a week earlier on the 24th of November 1854. At about 11 o'clock the Southern Cross was hoisted, and its maiden appearance was a fascinating object to behold. The flag was believed to have been sewn by Anastasia Hayes, reportedly influenced by earlier designs such as the Australian Federation flag, as a gesture of defiance. It deliberately excluded the British Union flag, which is included in the official flag of Australia. The Eureka flag was commonly referred to at the time as the Australian flag, and as the Southern Cross, with the Age variously reporting, on the 28th of November, the Australian flag shall triumphantly wave in the sunshine of its own blue and peerless sky, over thousands of Australia's adopted sons. The day after the battle, they assembled round the Australian flag, which has now a permanent flag staff, and during the 1855 Eureka trials, that it was sworn that the Eureka flag was also known as the Diggers' flag, and also as the Southern Cross. Remember Vinegar Hill. Irish dimension factors in dwindling numbers at Stockade. The Argus newspaper of the 4th of December 1854 reported that the Union Jack had to be hoisted underneath the Eureka flag at the Stockade, and that both flags were by then in the possession of the foot police. Some have questioned whether this sole contemporaneous report of the otherwise unaccounted for Union Jack being present is accurate. Former CEO of the Royal Australian Historical Society, John Vaughan, theorized that the Union Jack in the adjacent government camp may have created an optical illusion, whilst others in defense of this alternative scenario have stressed that the investigating journalist may have had available eyewitness reports of the two flags having been seized, and that it was possibly an 11th-hour response to the divided loyalties among the heterogeneous rebel force which was in the process of melting away. With Laller's choice of password for the night of the 2nd of December, Vinegar Hill, causing support for the rebellion to fall away among those who were otherwise disposed to resist the military, as word spread that the question of Irish Home Rule had become involved. Gregory Black, military historian and author of Eureka Stockade, a ferocious and bloody battle, concedes two flags may have been flown on the day of the battle, as the miners were claiming to be defending their British rights, with a further article in the Argus on the 9th of December 1854, reporting that Constable Hugh King had found a Union Jack-like flag being carried by a prisoner, and, according to the Eureka Encyclopedia, Sergeant John McNeill at the time shredded a flag at the Spencer Street Barracks in Melbourne, which was said to be the Eureka flag, but which may well have been a Union Jack. It is certain that Irish-born people were strongly represented at the Eureka Stockade. Eureka historians have discovered that, as well as comprising most of the miners inside the stockade at the finish, the area where the defensive position was established was overwhelmingly populated by the Irish to begin with. Professor Geoffrey Blaney has advanced the view that the white cross behind the stars on the Eureka flag really is an Irish cross rather than being a configuration of the Southern Cross. Departing detachment of independent Californian Rangers leaves small garrison behind during the 2nd of December. The peak rebel force trained in and around the stockade. A further 200 Americans, the independent Californian Rangers, under the leadership of James McGill, arrived about 4 p.m. The Americans were armed with revolvers and Mexican knives and possessed horses. In a fateful decision, McGill decided to take most of the Californian Rangers away from the stockade to intercept rumored British reinforcements coming from Melbourne. Reg spies observed these actions. That night many of the miners went back to their own tents after the traditional Saturday night carousing, with the assumption that the Queen's military forces would not be sent to attack on the Sabbath. A small contingent of miners remained at the stockade overnight, which the spies reported to Reed. Stockade. The stockade itself was a ramshackle affair which was hastily constructed over the following days from timber and overturned carts. The structure was never meant to be a military stockade or fortress. In the words of Laylaw, "It was nothing more than an enclosure to keep our own men together, and was never erected with an eye to military defense." Laylaw had already outlined a plan whereby, if the government forces come to attack us, we should meet them on the gravel pits, and if compelled, we should retreat by the heights to the old Canadian Gully, and there we shall make our final stand. Siege of the Eureka Stockade. By the beginning of December, the police contingent at Ballarat had been joined and surpassed in number by soldiers from British Army garrisons in Victoria, including detachments from the 12th Regiment of Foot and 40th Regiment of Foot. At 3 a.m. on Sunday 3 December, a party of 276 soldiers and police, under the command of Captain John W. Thomas, approached the Eureka Stockade and a battle ensued. There is no agreement as to which side fired first, but the battle was fierce, brief, and terribly one-sided. The ramshackle army of miners was hopelessly outclassed by a military regiment, and was routed in about 10 minutes. During the height of the battle, Laylaw was shot in his left arm, took refuge under some timber and was smuggled out of the stockade and hidden. His arm was later amputated. Stories tell you how women ran forward and threw themselves over the injured to prevent further indiscriminate killing. The Commission of Inquiry would later say that it was a needless as well as a ruthless sacrifice of human life, indiscriminate of innocent or guilty. And after all resistance had disappeared, early in the battle, Captain Henry Ross was shot dead. According to Laller's report, 14 miners died inside the stockade and an additional 8 died later from injuries they sustained. A further dozen were wounded but recovered. 3 months after the Eureka Stockade, Peter Laylaw wrote, "As the inhuman brutalities practiced by the troops are so well known, it is unnecessary for me to repeat them. There were 34 digger casualties, of which 22 died. The unusual proportion of the killed to the wounded is owing to the butchery of the military and troopers after the surrender. During the battle, Trooper John King, the police constable, took down the Eureka flag. By 8 a.m., Captain Charles Pasley, the second in command of the British forces, sickened by the carnage, saved a group of prisoners from being bayoneted and threatened to shoot any police or soldiers who continued with the slaughter. Pasley's valuable assistance was acknowledged in dispatches printed and laid before the Victorian Legislative Council. 114 diggers, some wounded, were marched off to the government camp about 2 kilometers away, where they were kept in an overcrowded lock-up, before being moved to a more spacious barn on Monday morning. Estimates of the death toll of the soldiers and police: 6 were killed, including Captain Wise. Martial law was imposed, and all armed resistance collapsed. News of the battle spread quickly to Melbourne and other goldfield regions, turning a perceived government military victory in repressing a minor insurrection into a public relations disaster. Thousands of people in Melbourne turned out to condemn the authorities, in defiance of their mayor and some legislative councillors, who tried to rally support for the government. In Ballarat, only one man responded to the call for special constables, although in Melbourne 1,500 were sworn in and armed with batons. Many people voiced their support for the diggers' requested reforms. Exact numbers of deaths and injuries and persons are difficult to determine, as many miners fled to the surrounding bush, and it is likely a good many more died a lonely death or suffered the agony of their wounds, hidden from the authorities for fear of repercussions, according to Eureka researcher and author Dorothy Wickham. The official register of deaths in the Ballarat District Register shows 27 names associated with the Stockade battle at Eureka. Historian Claire Wright quotes one source, Thomas Pearson, who noted in the margin to his diary, "Time has proved that near 60 have died of the diggers in all." According to Wright, Captain Thomas estimated that 30 diggers died on the spot and many more died of their wounds subsequently. Even the Geelong Advertiser on 8 December 1854 stated that deaths were more numerous than originally supposed. While it has been thought all the deaths at Eureka were men, Research by historian Claire Wright details that at least one woman lost her life in the massacre. Wright's research details the important role of women on the goldfields and in the reform movement. Her book Forgotten Rebels of Eureka details how Charles Evans' diary describes a funeral for a woman who was mercilessly butchered by a mounted trooper while pleading for the life of her husband during the Eureka massacre. Her name and the fate and identity of her husband remain unknown.